Hope you enjoy being homeless because I made sure you get nothing." My father said it loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smiled. One man near the back actually chuckled. The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Heavy, ugly, impossible to ignore. I stared at my father across the courtroom. William Morgan, 68 years old, owner of a successful construction company in Columbus, Ohio. A respected businessman, a church donor, a man people described as honorable, a man who had spent most of my life treating me like I was a mistake. And at that moment, he looked proud. Not angry, not emotional, proud, as though humiliating his own daughter in public was some kind of achievement. Then I laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a bitter laugh, a genuine laugh, the kind that escaped before I could stop it. My father's smile vanished. "What's so funny?" he snapped. Before I could answer, the judge looked up from the documents in front of him. His eyes settled on me. For a moment, he looked confused, then curious, then strangely familiar. "Wait," he said. The entire courtroom became silent. He leaned forward. "You're the girl who," and suddenly every person in that room was staring at me. But to explain what happened next, I need to tell you how I got there. Because that courtroom battle didn't begin that morning. It started more than 20 years earlier. Back when I was a little girl trying desperately to earn my father's love. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 34 years old. And for most of my life, I believed there was something wrong with me. I grew up in a modest neighborhood outside Columbus. My father built houses. My mother stayed home. My older brother, Michael, was 6 years ahead of me. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. Inside the house, things felt different. Michael was my father's pride. I was simply there. I noticed it before I was 10 years old. If Michael got a B on a test, Dad celebrated. If I got straight A's, Dad nodded and changed the subject. If Michael scored a touchdown, Dad invited the whole family out for dinner. If I won an academic award, he usually forgot to attend the ceremony. At first I thought I just needed to try harder. Children always assume they can earn love, so I tried. God knows I tried. I worked harder in school, helped around the house, avoided trouble, made honor roll every year. Nothing changed. One evening when I was about 13, I finally asked my mother, "Dad doesn't like me much, does he?" She looked heartbroken. For a second, I thought she might tell me the truth. Instead, she smiled weakly. "Of course, he loves you." I remember staring at my plate. "That's not what I asked." She never answered. That silence followed me for years. Michael didn't help. As we got older, he became increasingly like our father. Confident, entitled, certain the world revolved around him. Dad gave him opportunities I never received. A summer job at the company, a company truck, business mentoring, networking introductions. When Michael graduated college, Dad handed him a management position. No interview, no competition, just handed it over. I worked my way through nursing school with scholarships and part-time jobs. Dad barely noticed. Then September 11th happened. Like millions of Americans, I watched the towers fall. Something changed inside me. I wanted my life to matter. I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. A year later, I joined the Army. The conversation with my father remains one of the clearest memories of my life. We sat at the kitchen table. I was 20 years old, nervous, but excited. "Dad, I enlisted." He stared at me. "What? The Army?" For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he laughed. Not because he thought I was joking. Because he thought I was stupid. "The Army?" I nodded. "I want to serve." His face hardened. "You want to throw your life away?" "I don't see it that way." "Of course you don't." That was the beginning of our longest argument. He told me I was making a mistake. I told him I had made my decision. He accused me of abandoning the family. I reminded him Michael already had the company. Eventually, he stood up. "You'll regret this." I never forgot those words because I never did regret it. Not once. Military life wasn't easy. There were deployments, long nights, dangerous situations, friends who didn't come home. But for the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. Nobody cared whose daughter I was. Nobody cared who my father favored. The Army measured performance, character, discipline, trust, things I could actually control. Over time, I became a combat medic, then an officer. I built a career, built friendships, built a purpose. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father grew colder. Phone calls became rare. Visits became shorter. Every holiday felt like walking into a room where I wasn't wanted. Still, I kept trying because no matter how old we get, part of us remains that child waiting for a parent to finally say, "I'm proud of you." The words never came. Years passed. Then my grandfather died. Grandpa Henry was different from my father. Kind, patient, fair. He treated Michael and me equally. When I visited, he asked about my deployments, my patience, my life. He listened, actually listened. After he passed away, I was devastated. The funeral was difficult, but what happened afterward proved even worse. A few months later, my father informed me there would be an estate hearing. Nothing unusual. Families handle inheritances every day. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I didn't care much about the money. I attended out of respect for my grandfather. Then I arrived at the courthouse. The atmosphere felt strange immediately. Michael looked smug. My father looked confident. My mother looked nervous. The attorneys exchanged paperwork. The hearing began. One document after another was reviewed. Then came the announcement. Michael would receive nearly everything. The company shares, the investment accounts, the properties, the savings, everything. I received nothing. Not a dollar, not a keepsake, not even my grandfather's old watch. Nothing. For a moment, I simply sat there trying to process what I'd heard. Then my father leaned toward me. A smile spread across his face. The smile of a man finally delivering a punishment he'd waited years to give. And that's when he said it. "Hope you enjoy being homeless because I made sure you get nothing." The room became silent. I looked at him. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because suddenly something felt very wrong. Very wrong indeed. And judging by the expression forming on the judge's face, I wasn't the only one who sensed it. The courtroom remained quiet after my father's remark. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between us. Some people looked embarrassed for me, others looked curious. Most seemed to assume they were witnessing a simple inheritance dispute. A bitter daughter. A disappointed father. Nothing unusual. The judge, however, wasn't looking at my father anymore. He was looking directly at me. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with recognition, the kind of expression someone gets when they're trying to remember where they've seen a face before. He glanced down at the paperwork, then back at me, then down again. The room felt strangely still. Even my father seemed unsettled. "Your Honor," his attorney finally asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said slowly. "Have we met before?" I blinked. "No, sir." His forehead wrinkled. "That's odd." He studied me another moment. Then he shook his head and returned his attention to the documents. The hearing resumed, but something had changed. I could feel it. The judge wasn't paying attention the same way he had before. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward me again, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Meanwhile, my father sat confidently beside Michael. Neither of them noticed. Or perhaps they simply didn't care. They believed they had already won. And maybe they would have if life hadn't taken a very unexpected turn several years earlier. A turn my family knew almost nothing about because they never asked. Most of my military career was invisible to them. They knew I served. They knew I deployed. That was about it. Whenever I visited home, conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Dad would ask when I planned to leave the army. Michael would talk about the company. Mom would try to keep everyone polite. Then we'd all go home. No one ever asked what I had experienced overseas. No one ever asked what I had seen or who I had become. Perhaps that's why they never learned about Afghanistan. 5 years earlier, I was serving as a combat medic attached to an army unit operating near Kandahar. It wasn't my first deployment, but it was the hardest. The region was dangerous. Roadside bombs, rocket attacks, constant uncertainty. Every day required focus. The smallest mistake could get someone killed. By then, I was a captain, experienced enough to stay calm under pressure, at least most of the time. The incident that changed everything happened on an unusually hot afternoon in July. I remember the heat more than anything. The air felt thick. The dust seemed to cover everything. We had just returned from a patrol when alarms sounded across the compound. At first, nobody understood what was happening. Then the explosion hit. The blast shook the ground beneath us. Windows shattered. Smoke filled the air. People started yelling. Training took over. Everyone moved automatically. Soldiers rushed toward defensive positions. Medics rushed toward the wounded. I ran toward the explosion. Not because I was brave, because that's what medics do. When everyone else runs away from danger, we run toward it. The damaged structure was partially collapsed. Fire spread rapidly through one section. Several soldiers had been trapped inside. The situation was chaotic. People shouted conflicting information. Nobody knew exactly how many were missing. I remember reaching the building entrance. A sergeant grabbed my arm. "Captain, it's too dangerous." I pulled free. There are still people inside. Then I went in. The smoke was overwhelming. Visibility was terrible. The heat felt like opening an oven door directly into my face. Inside, everything was confusion. Broken concrete, twisted metal, falling debris. I located the first injured soldier near a collapsed wall. He was conscious but unable to walk. I dragged him outside, then went back in again and again. Each trip became more dangerous. The fire continued spreading. Parts of the structure were becoming unstable. Someone outside shouted that the roof might collapse. They were probably right, but there were still voices inside. I could hear them. One belonged to a young lieutenant, barely 25 years old, pinned beneath debris, terrified. I managed to reach him during my fourth entry. The situation was bad. His leg was trapped. Smoke was thickening. The ceiling groaned above us. For a moment, I honestly thought we might both die there, but somehow we got him free. I don't remember much after that. Only fragments. The weight, the heat, the exhaustion, the sound of people yelling outside when we emerged. Then darkness. I woke up 2 days later. Concussion, smoke inhalation, minor injuries, nothing life-threatening. The lieutenant survived. So did several others. In total, 6 soldiers were pulled from that building. The army conducted an investigation. Statements were collected. Reports were written. Then life moved forward. At least for me. The military later awarded me a medal for the rescue. There was a ceremony, a few photographs, some media coverage, the usual things. I never thought much about it afterward. Most veterans don't. You do your job. You move on. Besides, countless service members had done far more heroic things than I ever would. What mattered to me was simple. People came home alive. That was enough. The strange part came months later. A letter arrived, handwritten, unexpected. Inside was a message from the father of the young lieutenant I had helped rescue. He thanked me for saving his son, said there were no words large enough to express his gratitude. The letter was deeply personal, heartfelt. I kept it in a drawer. Nothing more. Life continued. Another deployment. Another assignment. Another year. Eventually, I forgot about the letter altogether. And apparently, my family never knew it existed. Not that they would have cared. Back in the courtroom, the hearing entered its second hour. The attorneys continued discussing assets, property valuations, account transfers, legal language that bored everyone except the lawyers. I noticed the judge becoming increasingly distracted. At one point, he removed his glasses entirely. He stared at me, not casually, intently. Then he opened a folder, flipped through several pages, stopped. His eyes widened. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. The judge suddenly looked as though he had found something important. Very important. Slowly, he raised his head. The courtroom fell silent again. My father shifted in his chair. "What is it?" Michael whispered. Nobody answered. The judge continued staring at me. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then his expression changed completely. Recognition. Absolute recognition. As if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. He leaned forward. "Miss Morgan?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice sounded almost disbelieving. "Your full name is Rachel Ann Morgan." "Yes, sir." He sat back slowly. A look of astonishment crossed his face. Then he whispered words that made my heart skip. Words I never expected to hear in that courtroom. "Dear God." The judge stared at me, and suddenly I realized he remembered exactly who I was. "Dear God." The judge's voice barely rose above a whisper. Yet somehow, everyone in the courtroom heard it. The room fell completely silent. No rustling papers, no whispered conversations, no movement, just silence. I sat frozen in my chair. The judge stared at me as though he had just seen a ghost. My father looked irritated. Michael looked confused. The attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said carefully, "would you please stand?" I slowly rose to my feet. Every eye in the room followed me. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow done something wrong. The judge continued studying me. Then he asked a question I never expected. "Were you serving near Kandahar 5 years ago?" My stomach tightened. "Yes, sir." A murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge nodded slowly. "And were you the army captain who entered a burning operations building multiple times after an enemy attack?" The room became even quieter. I could actually hear the air conditioning system humming above us. I hesitated, not because I was hiding anything. I simply hated talking about it. "Yes, sir." The judge closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they looked emotional. Very emotional. My father shifted uncomfortably. "What does this have to do with anything?" he asked. The judge ignored him. Instead, he continued looking at me. "Captain Rachel Morgan." I hadn't heard anyone call me that in months. Not since leaving active service. The title sounded strange inside a probate courtroom. The judge nodded to himself. Then he turned toward the spectators, toward the attorneys, toward everyone. "I cannot believe this." My father frowned. "Your Honor." The judge finally looked at him. What happened next changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "You really don't know who your daughter is, do you?" The question hit my father like a slap. His face wrinkled immediately. "What is that supposed to mean?" The judge leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked directly at me. "I owe this woman more than I can ever repay." The room exploded into whispers. My father looked stunned. Michael looked even worse. I felt my heart begin to pound. Because suddenly I knew exactly what was happening. The letter. The young lieutenant. The father. Oh my God. The judge wasn't just someone who had heard about the rescue. He was the father. The realization hit me all at once. The courtroom seemed to shrink around me. The judge slowly stood. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody dared. My son was serving in Afghanistan 5 years ago. His voice was steady, but emotion lingered beneath every word. He was trapped inside a building after an enemy attack. Several people in the courtroom leaned forward. The judge continued. The military I still remember receiving that phone call. For the first time, he sounded less like a judge and more like a father. A father remembering one of the worst days of his life. My wife and I spent hours believing our son might be dead. The courtroom remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We later learned he survived because a combat medic repeatedly entered a burning structure to rescue trapped soldiers. He looked at me directly at me. That medic was Captain Rachel Morgan. A collective gasp swept across the room. I heard someone whisper, "Wow." Another person muttered, "No way." My father simply stared. The confident smile he'd worn all morning had vanished completely. The judge wasn't finished. Most people never hear about acts of courage like that. His gaze moved across the room. They happen every day among the men and women who serve this country. Then he looked back at my father. But occasionally, one of those stories becomes very personal. His voice softened. My son came home because of her. Nobody spoke. I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me. The attention made me uncomfortable. It always had. I wished I could disappear, but the judge continued. Captain Morgan suffered injuries during the rescue. I quietly shook my head. They weren't serious. He smiled sadly. That's exactly what my son said you would say. A few people laughed softly. The tension broke for a moment. Then the judge reached into his briefcase. He opened a worn leather folder. From inside, he removed a folded piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. A copy of the letter, the one he had written years earlier. I keep this in my office. His voice grew quieter. I read it every Veterans Day. My throat tightened. I hadn't expected that. Not at all. The judge unfolded the paper. Then he read a few lines aloud. Not many. Just enough. Enough to understand. Enough to feel the weight behind the words. A father thanking the woman who saved his son. A family expressing gratitude that could never truly be repaid. When he finished, nobody spoke. Several people looked emotional. One elderly woman in the gallery wiped her eyes. Even one of the attorneys looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that comes from realizing you've misjudged someone. The judge folded the letter carefully. Then he turned toward my father again. What surprises me most, he said, is that this appears to be news to her family. My father swallowed. For the first time all day, he looked unsure of himself. Michael finally spoke. You never told us. I looked at him. You never asked. The words came out gently, not angry, not bitter. Simply true. Michael looked away. My mother lowered her head. Tears had begun forming in her eyes. I wasn't sure whether they came from pride or guilt. Perhaps both. The judge slowly returned to his seat, but before sitting down, he said something that nobody in that room would ever forget, including me. He looked directly at my father. His expression was calm, controlled, yet there was steel beneath it. The kind of steel that comes from conviction. You may not know who your daughter is, Mr. Morgan. The room held its breath. But I do. Silence. Absolute silence. My father had spent decades building a reputation, building authority, building status. Yet in that moment, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not because the judge humiliated him, because the truth had. For years, Dad had viewed me as the disappointing daughter. The daughter who abandoned the family business. The daughter who chose military service over his approval. The daughter who could never measure up to Michael. Now strangers in the courtroom were looking at me with more respect than my father had shown in 20 years. And for the first time, I think he realized it. The judge glanced back down at the estate documents. His expression changed. The emotional moment was over. Now he was a judge again. Professional, methodical, sharp. He picked up one of the files, flipped through several pages, then stopped. His eyes narrowed. The room grew quiet once more. A different kind of quiet. Not emotional. Concerned. The judge examined a document. Then another. Then another. Slowly, he looked toward my father's attorney. Counselor. The attorney straightened. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped the paperwork with one finger. His face had become unreadable. I have a question regarding these asset transfers. My father's expression changed instantly, and for the first time that day, I saw fear. Real fear. The fear appeared for only a second. Most people in the courtroom probably missed it. I didn't. When you've spent years in the military, you learn to notice tiny changes in people. A tightened jaw. A sudden shift in posture. A glance that lasts a fraction too long. Fear has a way of revealing itself, and my father was afraid. The judge held up a document. Counselor, can you explain this transfer? My father's attorney adjusted his glasses. Which transfer, Your Honor? The Riverside property. The attorney accepted the document. His confident expression faded almost immediately. I'll need a moment. The judge nodded. You have one. A strange tension settled over the room. The kind that appears when something unexpected enters the conversation. Something nobody planned for. My father sat perfectly still. Too still. Michael noticed it too. Dad. No response. Dad. My father finally looked at him. It's nothing. But it didn't sound like nothing. The judge continued reviewing paperwork. Several minutes passed. Then he located another document. His expression darkened further. Interesting. Nobody liked the sound of that word, especially lawyers. The attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, there may be a clerical explanation. Perhaps. The judge picked up another file. Then maybe you can explain this one as well. The attorney accepted it. Read it. Then frowned. I watched him carefully. Whatever he was seeing, he clearly hadn't expected it. That surprised me. Until that moment, I had assumed everyone involved knew exactly what was happening. Apparently, they didn't. The judge leaned back. Let's take a brief recess. His gavel struck. People immediately began whispering. Attorneys gathered around tables. Spectators discussed the military story they'd just heard. The atmosphere felt completely different now. The inheritance hearing had transformed into something else, something bigger. I remained seated. I wasn't interested in gossip. I simply wanted answers. A few moments later, my mother approached. She looked older than I remembered, smaller, somehow, fragile. Rachel. I looked up. Hi, Mom. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know. I already knew what she meant. The rescue. She nodded. Why didn't you tell us? I offered a sad smile. When would I have told you? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she knew the answer. There hadn't been a moment. Not one. Over the years, our conversations had become polite exchanges about weather, holidays, and schedules. Nothing deeper. Nothing real. My mother sat beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered something that hurt more than I expected. I should have asked. I nodded. Yeah. She looked down at her hands. I should have asked a lot of things. Across the room, Michael was arguing quietly with our father. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read body language. Michael looked frustrated. Dad looked defensive. That alone felt unusual. For most of my life, Michael had followed Dad's lead without question. Now, something had changed. The recess ended 15 minutes later. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge immediately resumed reviewing documents. No small talk, no delay, straight to business. Before proceeding, he said, I have concerns regarding several transactions connected to this estate. The room became silent again. The attorney rose. We are prepared to address any concerns, Your Honor. Good. The judge held up a folder. Because I have many. A few people exchanged nervous glances. The judge began listing dates, property transfers, investment reallocations, changes to ownership records. Most sounded incredibly boring until he reached one specific date. A date that made my mother's face go pale. The judge noticed. So, you recognize that date? My mother hesitated. Yes. What is its significance? She looked toward my father. For a moment, I thought she might remain silent, just as she had remained silent so many times before. Then something unexpected happened, she answered. That was the week my father was hospitalized. The room grew still. The judge nodded. Your father being Henry Lawson? Yes. My grandfather. The judge continued. Medical records indicate he was heavily medicated during that period. My father's attorney stood quickly. Objection. On what grounds? The attorney hesitated. The judge waited. No answer came. Finally, the judge continued. During that same period, multiple estate modifications were executed. The room seemed to shrink around us. I looked at my father. His face had become expressionless, but I could see the tension in his eyes. The judge wasn't accusing anyone yet. He was simply laying out facts. Yet, those facts sounded increasingly troubling. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge opened another folder, a thick one. He removed a handwritten document. What is that? Michael asked. Nobody answered. The judge examined the paper carefully. Then he spoke. This appears to be an earlier version of Mr. Lawson's estate plan. My heartbeat quickened. Earlier version. The attorney looked confused. I wasn't aware such a document existed. Apparently, neither were several other people. The judge began reading portions aloud. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to establish a shocking fact. My grandfather's original estate plan had divided assets equally between Michael and me. 50/50. Exactly. Equally. The courtroom erupted. People whispered openly now. Even the attorneys looked stunned. I sat frozen, unable to process what I had heard. Equal. Grandpa had intended equal. All these years, I had assumed he simply preferred Michael, just like Dad did. Apparently, I had been wrong. Very wrong. My throat tightened. I suddenly remembered countless conversations with Grandpa. The way he'd always treated me fairly. The way he'd never compared me to Michael. The way he'd always listened. Of course he hadn't cut me out. He never would have. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. Across the room, Michael looked horrified. Dad? My father stared straight ahead. Not moving. Not speaking. Michael's voice shook. Dad? What is this? Still no answer. The judge folded the document, then looked directly at my father. Mr. Morgan. Nothing. Mr. Morgan. Slowly, Dad raised his eyes. The judge's voice remained calm, but firm. Can you explain why your father-in-law's original estate plan differs so dramatically from the final version? Silence. A long silence. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, William Morgan appeared completely unprepared. The man always had answers, always had explanations, always controlled the room. Not today. The judge continued. Perhaps more importantly, he lifted another document. Can you explain why several transfers appear to benefit only one beneficiary? Michael looked stunned. Beneficiary? The judge turned a page. Your son. The color drained from Michael's face because suddenly he realized something. This wasn't simply about me being excluded. This wasn't just favoritism. This was something far more serious. If these documents were accurate, my father hadn't merely hurt me, he may have manipulated an entire estate. An estate belonging to a dying man who trusted him. And for the first time, Michael looked at Dad, not with admiration, but with doubt. The judge closed the folder. His expression was grave. I'm ordering a full review of these records. The room exploded into murmurs. My father finally spoke. That's ridiculous. The judge's gaze hardened. No. Mr. Morgan, he paused. What's ridiculous is that these questions were never asked sooner. And suddenly, I understood something. The inheritance hearing wasn't ending. It was just beginning. For most of my life, my father had been the strongest man in every room. Not physically, not emotionally, but socially, financially, professionally. People listened when William Morgan spoke. Bankers respected him. Business owners sought his advice. Church leaders praised his generosity. Neighbors admired his success. My father had spent decades building a reputation. And now, for the first time, I was watching cracks form in that foundation. The court-ordered review moved quickly, faster than I expected. The judge postponed further estate proceedings pending investigation. Within weeks, accountants began examining records, property transactions, bank statements, estate documents, tax filings, everything. I returned to my normal life. At least I tried to. I was no longer on active duty, having recently transitioned into civilian healthcare work at a veterans medical center outside Columbus. My days were filled with patients, men and women who had served. Many carried visible wounds, others carried invisible ones. Working with them helped keep me grounded. The courtroom drama felt distant until the phone calls started. First came my mother, then my attorney, then Michael. Everyone wanted to talk. Everyone suddenly wanted answers. For years, nobody had shown much interest in my life. Now, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The irony wasn't lost on me. One afternoon, my attorney called. Rachel, I thought you'd want an update. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee. Good news or bad news? A pause. Depends on how you define good. That wasn't encouraging. What did they find? More than expected. I closed my eyes. Part of me already knew. The evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Several transactions appeared questionable. Some occurred while my grandfather was heavily medicated. Others involved sudden ownership changes. A few signatures were being examined by forensic specialists. The words made my stomach turn. Not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. Deep down, I think I had known for years that something wasn't right. I simply never wanted to believe my father could go that far. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad, profoundly sad, because every new discovery damaged not only my father, it damaged the entire family. A week later, the local newspaper published an article. Nothing dramatic. Just a brief report about an ongoing probate dispute involving a prominent businessman. No accusations, no conclusions, just facts. Yet that was enough. In small communities, people noticed things. Within days, rumors spread. Questions followed. Business associates became cautious. Clients grew nervous. People started talking. For the first time in decades, my father was no longer controlling the narrative. The truth was beginning to speak for itself. Then Michael showed up at my house unannounced. I nearly didn't recognize him. He looked exhausted. Older, defeated. Nothing like the confident older brother I remembered. When I opened the door, he stood there awkwardly. Can we talk? I hesitated, then nodded. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I usually paid bills and sorted mail. Nothing fancy. Nothing impressive. Michael stared at his coffee for nearly a minute. Finally, he spoke. Did you know? Know what? That grandpa wanted things divided equally. I shook my head. No. His shoulders slumped. I didn't either. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he laughed bitterly. I spent my entire life believing I earned everything. His words carried genuine pain. Not arrogance, pain. I thought Dad trusted me more. I looked at him carefully. The realization was hitting him hard because favoritism hurts everyone, including the favorite, especially the favorite. It creates impossible expectations, distorted relationships, false confidence. Michael was finally seeing that. I never asked for this, he said quietly. I know. I honestly thought Grandpa changed his mind. I know. He looked at me. His eyes were red. You hate me, don't you? The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. Years of resentment, years of unfair treatment, years of comparisons. Then I shook my head. No. His expression softened slightly. I probably would. I smiled sadly. Maybe when I was younger. We sat in silence. For the first time in our lives, we weren't competing. We weren't arguing. We weren't playing roles assigned by our father. We were simply two people trying to understand what had happened to our family. Before leaving, Michael stopped at the door. Rachel. Yeah. I'm sorry. The words were simple but sincere. And somehow that mattered a lot. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice sounded fragile. Would you come by? I almost said no. Almost. Instead, I drove to the house where I grew up. The same house. The same front porch. The same maple tree in the yard. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow smaller. My mother greeted me at the door. The moment I saw her face, I knew something had changed. She looked exhausted, emotionally exhausted. We sat in the living room, the room where decades of family history had unfolded. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, silences, all of it. My mother twisted a tissue in her hands. Then she finally said what she'd been carrying for years. I knew some things weren't right. I remained silent. I didn't know everything. Her voice cracked, but I knew enough. The words hurt. Not because they shocked me, because they confirmed what I'd always suspected. You could have said something. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I know you could have defended me. I know you could have stopped some of it. She lowered her head. I know. The room fell silent. For years I had imagined this conversation, imagined yelling, imagined anger, imagined confrontation. Instead, all I felt was sadness. My mother wasn't evil. She wasn't cruel. She was weak. And weakness has consequences, sometimes devastating ones. Before I left, she hugged me. For a long time, longer than she ever had when I was young. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much left to say. Weeks turned into months. The investigation continued. Evidence accumulated. Questions multiplied. Meanwhile, my father seemed to withdraw from the world. Friends stopped calling as often. Business lunches disappeared. Community invitations slowed. People who once praised him now avoided uncomfortable conversations. Success attracts company. Scandal creates distance. One evening I drove past his office building. The parking lot was nearly empty. The lights were off. For some reason that image stayed with me. Not because I enjoyed it, because I didn't. The man who had spent decades chasing status was discovering how fragile status really is. Money can disappear. Reputation can collapse. Power can fade. What remains is character. And character is much harder to build. A few days later, I received another call from my attorney. The review was almost complete. I stared out my apartment window and a long pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. Rachel, I think your father is about to lose far more than this case. After the call ended, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, thinking, not about inheritance, not about money, not about revenge. I thought about family, about choices, about consequences. And somewhere across town, for perhaps the first time in his life, William Morgan was sitting alone with his own. 3 weeks after my attorney told me the investigation was nearly complete, I received a phone call I never expected. It was my father. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. William Morgan. I couldn't remember the last time he'd called me first. Usually communication happened through my mother or not at all. The phone rang 4 times before I answered. Hello. Silence. Then his voice, older than I remembered, tired. Rachel. I waited. I'd like to see you. No apology. No explanation. Just those words. I leaned back in my chair. Why? Another pause. Because there are things I should have said a long time ago. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after 20 years, that statement felt absurd. There were thousands of things he should have said. Thousands. Instead, he had chosen silence, criticism, distance. I looked out the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. I don't know if that's a good idea. I understand. His voice sounded defeated. Not angry. Not defensive. Defeated. Something about that unsettled me. My father had never sounded defeated before. Not once. Finally, he spoke again. Please. One word. Quiet. Almost fragile. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted to protect myself from whatever came next. But another part of me was tired. Tired of carrying old wounds. Tired of unanswered questions. Tired of wondering why. Where there's a Veterans Memorial Park near downtown. I knew the place. A peaceful park overlooking the river. Several monuments. Rows of engraved names. A place people visited to remember. To reflect. To grieve. Tomorrow morning. Okay. And that was it. The call ended. I barely slept that night. Not because I feared him, because I feared disappointment. Again, the next morning was cool and overcast. The kind of Ohio morning that feels older than the calendar says. I arrived early. Old habits from military life. My father was already there, sitting on a bench near the memorial wall. For a moment, I simply watched him. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, spiritually, like life had finally become heavier than he could carry. When I approached, he stood awkwardly, almost nervously. I couldn't remember ever seeing him nervous. Thanks for coming, I nodded. Neither of us sat immediately. The silence stretched between us. 20 years of silence. Finally, I sat on the bench. He sat beside me, several feet away, like strangers. Maybe that's what we were. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled nearby trees. A flag moved gently above the memorial. Eventually, my father broke the silence. I saw the investigation report. I waited. They found enough. His voice sounded hollow. The findings had been devastating. Several estate modifications had been ruled improper. Multiple transfers had been reversed. The final legal consequences were still being resolved. But the truth was no longer in doubt. I know. He stared at the memorial wall. I deserve most of what's happened. The admission surprised me. My father had spent his entire life avoiding responsibility. Yet here he was accepting it, at least partially. Still, I wasn't ready to make things easy. Most of it, he nodded slowly. Fair question. For several seconds he gathered his thoughts. Then he surprised me again. I wasn't angry because you joined the army. I blinked. Of all the things I expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. What? I know that's what you believed. It is what you said. I know. His eyes remained fixed on the memorial. Is greater than. But it wasn't the truth. Is greater than I folded my arms. Then what was? The answer took a long time to come. When it finally did, it arrived in a voice I'd never heard before. A wounded voice. My brother, I frowned. My uncle Daniel had died long before I was born. The family rarely spoke about him. Almost never. He enlisted when he was 19. My father swallowed. He was killed overseas. The wind seemed to stop. For a moment, the world felt very quiet. I know. No. He shook his head. You know the facts. His eyes grew distant. I remember the funeral. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. I remember my mother crying every night. He stared toward the river. I remember my father never being the same again. I listened, not interrupting. For the first time in my life, my father was letting me see something beneath the armor. Something real. When you told me you'd enlisted, his voice cracked. All I could think about was Daniel. I sat perfectly still. Years of memories suddenly looked different. The arguments, the anger, the criticism, the constant disapproval. I thought I'd lose you, too. The words hit me harder than I expected. My father rubbed his face. For a moment, he looked like an exhausted old man. Not the powerful businessman everyone knew. Just an old man carrying decades of grief. I was terrified. He laughed bitterly, and instead of admitting that, he shook his head. I punished you for it. The truth settled heavily between us. Not an excuse, an explanation. Those are very different things. I understood that. He understood it, too. I should have been proud of you. His voice trembled. Instead, every promotion made me angry. I stared at him. Not because I doubted him. Because I believed him. Every word. I kept waiting for you to quit. He laughed softly. You never did. No. A faint smile appeared. No. For the first time that morning, we shared something close to humor. Then his smile vanished. His eyes filled with tears. Real tears. I had never seen my father cry. Not once. Not when his parents died. Not when businesses struggled. Not ever. Now tears rolled down his face. And he didn't even try to hide them. I failed you. The words came out broken, raw, honest. I failed you as a father. I felt my own eyes sting. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. Nothing was fixed. Years of damage don't disappear in one conversation. But honesty matters. Truth matters. And this was the first completely honest conversation we'd ever had. He looked at me. I am so sorry, Rachel. Not for the estate. Not for the investigation. Not for getting caught. For me, for us, for everything. The difference mattered a lot. The wind moved through the trees again. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore, just heavy human. My father wiped his eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I looked toward the memorial wall. Rows of names. Rows of stories. Rows of people who had sacrificed. Life teaches difficult lessons. Sometimes far too late. Maybe this was one of them. Finally, I looked back at him. The man who had hurt me. The man who had failed me. The man who was still my father. And for the first time in 20 years, I honestly considered forgiving him. A month after my conversation with my father at the Veterans Memorial Park, the estate case finally came to an end. By then, most of the legal questions had been answered. The investigation had confirmed what the judge had suspected. Several changes to my grandfather's estate had been made improperly. Assets that should never have been redirected were restored. The final ruling wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no shocking television-style courtroom scene. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were documents, hearings, corrections, and eventually resolution. My grandfather's wishes were honored.